At exactly 10:15 in the morning on the 12th of March, 2026, the West Wing of Buckingham Palace was silent in the way that palaces are silent, not with the absence of sound, but with the presence of people holding their breath. Footmen who had spent decades learning to move through corridors without being noticed found themselves frozen against the walls. Senior staff who prided themselves on the particular professional skill of appearing oblivious to whatever was happening around them were unable to sustain that performance. Because what was happening in that hallway was not the kind of thing that professional discretion was designed to manage. It was the kind of thing that gets remembered. Prince William stood facing Queen Camilla in the corridor outside the West Wing reception rooms. The distance between them was not large. The distance in every other sense was absolute. What had preceded this moment, the months of audit work, the sealed documents, the night hours in archive vaults, the recording played in a locked study at Adelaide Cottage, the digital mandate sent to the Crown's private bank before most of London was awake. All of it had been building to a confrontation that everyone in the palace had known was coming and nobody had known how to prevent. The financial infrastructure that had operated in the shadows of the royal household for 3 decades was, as of 8 o'clock that morning, already gone. The credit lines severed, the stipends canceled, the accounts frozen, the corporate cards deactivated. It had happened in the time it takes to process a bank transaction, and it had happened before Camilla's legal team had received any notification that it was coming. William looked at his stepmother directly. The accounts of those present are consistent on this point. He did not raise his voice, did not shift his posture, did not allow any of the emotion that must have been present somewhere inside him to reach his face. He was dressed, as he always is at official engagements, with a precision that communicates authority without ostentation. He looked, by every account, like a man who had been preparing for this specific moment for a very long time, and had arrived at it without any of the uncertainty that long preparation sometimes fails to eliminate. He spoke 7 words. 7 words that have since moved through palace circles and press circles, and the circles of people who follow the British Monarchy with the intensity of people following a story they know will matter for generations. He said, "The treasury is not your private dowry." He held her gaze for the length of time required to ensure the words had fully landed, not the polite social second of maintained eye contact, but the longer, deliberate moment that communicates that what has just been said is not the opening of a negotiation. Then he turned his back and walked away down the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps was the only thing in that hallway for a long moment after he was gone. Witnesses described Camilla as visibly shaken in a way that went beyond the ordinary range of royal composure failures. This was not a woman who had been surprised or insulted. This was a woman who had just been informed, in the most precise and personal language available, that the architecture she had been operating within for 20 years had been dismantled while she was asleep. That the financial world, the Parker Bowles family, had inhabited the stipends and the security details and the grace and favor accommodations and the corporate accounts that had made proximity to the crown a form of material inheritance was no longer accessible to them. That the man who had just walked away from her had decided this, had prepared it, had executed it, and had now delivered its announcement in 7 words and a turn back. To understand how it came to this, why this moment happened in this hallway on this morning with this finality, you have to go back almost a year. Back to the vaults of Sandringham House Library, where a team of 5 financial investigators were working in conditions of extreme secrecy on a project that had been given a designation so anodyne it would attract no attention from anyone who happened to see it filed. Operation Clean Slate. Back to a private villa in the hills of Wiltshire, where a man who had been silent for decades sat before a microphone for exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds and said everything he had been carrying. Back to a locked study at Adelaide Cottage, where a future king listened to that recording over and over in the dark and understood, with a clarity that was cold and complete, exactly what he was going to have to do. The 7 words in the corridor were the end of a very long story. This is the story of how they got there. The audit that would eventually bring down the Parker Bowles financial network was not triggered by a dramatic revelation or a single piece of decisive evidence. It was triggered, as the most consequential investigations usually are, by a pattern. A series of anomalies in the accounts connected to the ancillary security costs of the Queen's extended family costs that had been growing quietly for years in ways that individually seemed defensible and collectively suggested something that the people responsible for the duchy's financial integrity could not comfortably ignore. On the 15th of April, 2025, following a series of anonymous communications from individuals who had knowledge of the internal accounting and were no longer willing to maintain their silence, the Prince of Wales authorized the formation of a small and entirely deniable investigative unit. 5 financial investigators drawn from the National Audit Office and the private security infrastructure of the Duchy of Cornwall were assembled and given access to the highest security sections of the Sandringham House library, a room that does not appear in any public guide to the estate, and that had been used for the storage of sensitive financial documentation for decades. They worked through the nights in conditions of almost complete secrecy, and they did not stop until they had followed every thread in the ledger to its conclusion. The final report was given the designation Legacy Alpha. Its headline finding was a number: £14,850,200. That was the sum that had been diverted from the sovereign grant and the duchy's reserves through channels that bore no legitimate relationship to any official royal function. The scale was staggering, but it was not the scale that sharpened William's fury beyond the ordinary range of institutional anger. It was the method. What Legacy Alpha uncovered was a sophisticated network of 8 separate shell companies, each registered in jurisdictions chosen specifically for their minimal disclosure requirements and their resistance to international financial transparency mechanisms. These companies were not providing security services or maintaining royal properties or performing any of the functions that their paperwork claimed to describe. They were conduits, pipes, through which the accumulated wealth of the crown was flowing into the private accounts of people who had no official constitutional position and no claim on its resources beyond the accident of their family. Connection to the woman who had married the king? 12 individuals had been receiving what the audit classified as ancillary security stipends. When the investigators mapped the actual flow of those funds, the picture that emerged was not of security arrangements, but of a comprehensive private subsidy. Luxury travel, high-interest personal loan repayments, private debt settlements. Among the most damaging single findings was the concentration of payments into image consultancy firms owned by members of Camilla's immediate family. £4,322,180 had passed through these firms in the preceding 36 months alone. The firms had no employees, no commercial activity, no clients, other than the accounts feeding into them. They existed on paper, and they existed for one purpose. William received the final version of Legacy Alpha in the early hours of March 2nd, 2026. The Sandringham Library was empty by then, the investigators gone, the documents secured in the archive systems that only he and the most senior members of his legal team could access. He read through the report alone. In the specific quality of silence that exists in a large historic house at 3 o'clock in the morning when there is nobody else in the building who is awake and the only sounds are the kind that old buildings make when the temperature drops and the wood and the stone adjust to the cold. When he finished, he did not immediately call anyone or begin drafting instructions or reach for his phone. He went to the gallery. He sat in a chair positioned directly beneath a large portrait of his mother, Princess Diana. The portrait shows her as she was in the years of her greatest public prominence, composed, luminous, carrying the specific quality of presence that photographs captured imperfectly, and that people who saw her in person have always said was something that no photograph could fully convey. He stayed there for 4 hours. Staff at Sandringham, who became aware of his presence in the gallery during those hours, described the atmosphere as something they found difficult to characterize with any ordinary language. He was not visibly distressed. He was not pacing or agitated. He was not making calls or reviewing documents. He was simply present and still and thinking in the company of his mother's painted face, and the specific quality of silence that a gallery at 4 a.m. produces when the person sitting in it is deciding something that cannot be undecided. When he rose from the chair as the morning was beginning to come through the windows, the decision had been made. Nobody had to ask him what it was. The fate of the Parker Bowles financial empire had been determined in 4 hours of silence. The mechanism William chose to execute the oxygen cut was selected with the same precision that had characterized every element of the preparation. He did not go to Parliament. He did not initiate a formal legal process through the civil courts. He did not issue a public statement. Any of those routes would have given the opposing side time to prepare a response, to file injunctions, to engage the public narrative in ways that would have complicated the outcome he had decided on. Instead, he went to the architecture of the institution itself. Buried within the Sovereign Grant Act is a clause that grants the heir to the throne, in their capacity as manager of the Duchy of Cornwall, the unilateral authority to suspend payments from Crown reserves if those payments can be formally defined as constituting a direct threat to royal security or institutional integrity. The clause had been invoked rarely in its history and never in circumstances quite like these. William's legal team constructed the formal definition required to activate it. By characterizing the misappropriation of funds as a direct security threat to the Prince of Wales's own children's inheritance, they satisfied the legal threshold. The clause was activated. The parliamentary route was bypassed entirely. At 8:18 inches the morning on March 12th, a high-priority encrypted digital mandate was transmitted from the Duchy of Cornwall's legal office to the senior management team at Coutts and Company, the private bank managing the royal family's financial affairs. It demanded the immediate cessation of all secondary account activity connected to 12 named individuals and the complete revocation of all corporate credit cards, remote account access, and authorized payment channels associated with those names. The bank's compliance team processed the instructions within the legally required window. By the time William was walking down the West Wing corridor, the digital infrastructure of the Parker Bowles financial network had already ceased to exist. The oxygen cut worked in 4 stages. The first was the identification phase, 36 months of mapping every individual connected to Camilla's extended family, receiving any crown payment, producing a complete, legally documented picture of the network's extent. The second was the transparency threshold, lowering audit requirements for personal expenses to £500 and forcing every hidden luxury into the light of official documentation. The third was the cut itself, the digital mandate, the frozen accounts, the declined cards, executed in seconds. The fourth was the repossession protocol, formal notices of dissociation issued to 3 luxury estates occupied by Parker Bowles network members, giving 21 days to secure private funding or face formal seizure. William's legal team had even extended the cut to the specialized insurance policies covering jewelry and art collections, ensuring any attempt to liquidate royal-adjacent assets would trigger an immediate audit and recovery action by the duchy. The audit gave William the numbers, but the recording gave him something more important. It gave him certainty. On the 15th of April, 2025, the same day the clean slate investigation was formally authorized, a man who had been part of the story of the British royal family for decades without ever occupying its center was sitting in a private villa in the rolling hills of Wiltshire. He was alone except for the recording equipment. The recording lasted exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds. It was not a memoir and it was not an interview. It was a confession designed to function as an insurance policy, a digital document that would remain encrypted and hidden until the moment its creator determined that the protection it offered was more valuable as a weapon than as a shield. Andrew Parker Bowles had been silent for a very long time. The silence had served him. It had allowed him to maintain a position of studied neutrality in a family drama that had consumed decades of public attention without consuming him personally. But something had changed in the months before the recording was made, something that had been sufficient to bring him to that villa, before that microphone, to say the things he had been carrying for 30 years. His voice on the recording is described by those who have heard it as weathered but remarkably precise, the voice of someone who has rehearsed what they intend to say, not to make it sound rehearsed, but to ensure that nothing important is omitted and nothing ambiguous is left open to interpretation. He begins with a single sentence that functions as both an opening and a complete summary of everything that follows. The kingdom, he says, is resting on a delusion, and the private ledgers will show exactly who has been paying the price for the silence. What follows, in those 6 minutes and 42 seconds, is a description of a financial architecture that makes the £14 million identified in Legacy Alpha look like its most visible and accessible layer, the part of the iceberg that sits above the waterline and catches the light. Andrew describes offshore accounts and secret trusts constructed over 3 decades with the specific purpose of ensuring that certain individuals would never again be exposed to the financial vulnerabilities of ordinary private life. He names these payments, the term he uses is ghost stipends, and describes their recipients as individuals who do not appear on any official royal roster, whose connection to the royal household exists entirely through the informal mechanisms of social proximity, and whose continued silence about various matters has been maintained, in his telling, through a system of regular and substantial financial reward. He describes accounts in the Cayman Islands and in Zurich. He describes what he calls a shadow court, an informal, parallel structure operating alongside the official household, sustained by diverted crown funds, providing services and maintaining relationships that the official structure could not acknowledge and would not survive acknowledging. The recording was hand-delivered to William at 2:15 inches the afternoon on March 9th, 2026, 3 days before the confrontation in the West Wing. Staff at Adelaide Cottage later described the complete absence of any sound from his private study for several hours. He played those 6 minutes and 42 seconds repeatedly in the silence of a locked room. By the time he emerged, the moral framework for everything that would follow had been constructed in his mind with a completeness that no subsequent argument would dislodge. The audit had shown him what had happened. The recording had shown him why. The yellow drawing room at Buckingham Palace is used for the quiet reception of foreign dignitaries and private family meetings. On the morning of March 12th, after the digital mandate had already been processed and the accounts had already been frozen, Camilla arrived in that room with the energy of someone who has just discovered that something has happened to them without their knowledge or consent and is still in the process of understanding the full extent of it. What broke first was not the argument, but a piece of porcelain, the sharp, high-pitched crack of a George IV cup shattering against the parquet floor, a sound that witnesses in the corridor outside heard clearly and that will apparently be remembered by everyone who heard it for the rest of their professional lives. Camilla's words were not the words of a woman making a strategic argument. They were the words of someone pushed past the boundary of managed emotion into the territory where things that have never been said start coming out. She accused William of being a vigilante in the grip of an obsession with a past he could not change. And then she said the thing that could not be taken back. You are killing your father for the sake of a ghost. A direct and deliberate reference to Diana. The acknowledgement, spoken aloud in Buckingham Palace, that the ghost had never left the building. William stood beneath a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II and waited for her to finish. Then, he delivered the second sentence of the day that will be quoted for as long as the British monarchy exists in any form. He looked at her and said, "I will not let my mother's legacy pay for your family's silence." He turned his back and walked away. It was the same gesture he had used in the corridor that morning. The same finality. The same refusal to remain in the room once the essential thing had been said. By 9:30 that evening, the conflict had moved to the king's private study at Highgrove. Charles was, by every account, a man in genuine institutional paralysis. He reportedly asked William to show mercy, spoke about the years of shared life, about family, about the complexity of the relationships involved. William listened to all of it. Then he gestured to the pile of audit documents and said that the honor of the crown was more important than the comfort of private citizens who had been feeding from its resources for decades. Charles's approval rating was at 42%. His son's was at 68%. The public had made their assessment. The king, looking at those numbers and at those documents and at his son across the table, found that he had nothing left to offer that was sufficient to change the outcome. At 4:30 inches the morning on March 13th, 2026, a high-security courier left the side entrance of Clarence House carrying a small armored briefcase of the kind used for the transport of sensitive legal documents and physical data storage media. He did not use the main entrance. There was no official log of his departure in any of the palace's administrative systems. He was tracked not by any royal monitoring infrastructure, but by the independent investigators who had been maintaining surveillance of Clarence House's operational activity in the days following the Coutts mandate, on the reasonable assumption that a response was being prepared and that the response would not be telegraphed in advance through any channel that William's team might be monitoring. The courier's destination was confirmed through the logistics systems of the firm contracted for the transport, a third-party legal vault facility in Zurich, Switzerland. The choice of Zurich was not incidental. Switzerland's legal framework for the storage of sensitive materials is designed specifically to resist external pressure from foreign governments and foreign courts. The facility in question specializes in the secure storage of documents and digital media for individuals and organizations who require the absolute assurance that their materials cannot be accessed, seized, or destroyed by any party other than those named in the vault's access protocols, regardless of the nationality of those attempting to access them, regardless of the legal jurisdiction they are invoking, regardless of the urgency or the authority they claim to represent. Once an item is deposited in such a facility with the appropriate legal instructions attached, its release is governed entirely by those instructions. No court order from a British court, no royal mandate, no parliamentary legislation, not by anything except the specific conditions the depositor has specified and the specific deadline the depositor has set. What the courier was carrying, what is now sitting in that climate-controlled vault in Zurich, is what palace insiders have been calling the silver drive. A physical data storage device containing what Andrew Parker Bowles described in his Wiltshire recording as the decryption keys to the Royal Shadow Ledger, the complete financial documentation of the Ghost Stipend network, the offshore account structures in the Cayman Islands, the 30 years of diverted payments, and, most significantly, the encrypted video evidence and private correspondence that would connect the highest levels of the monarchy to financial arrangements whose existence Andrew had described and whose full scope Legacy Alpha had only begun to map. The £14,850,000 that the audit identified was, in Andrew's account, the visible surface of something considerably deeper and considerably more damaging to the institution's credibility. The drive contains the evidence of what lies beneath it. Camilla's legal team has constructed what is being referred to in the relevant circles as a dead man's switch, a mechanism designed to operate automatically without requiring any further decision or action from the person who authorized it. The vault instructions specify that if the Prince of Wales does not formally rescind the notices of financial dissociation within a defined window, or if the palace proceeds with any public disclosure of the Legacy Alpha audit findings, the legal instructions in Zurich automatically authorize the release of the drive's contents to a designated list of recipients that includes every major news outlet in the world with a European bureau. The mechanism requires no further action from Camilla or from anyone acting on her behalf. It runs on its own once the trigger conditions are met, with the cold, impersonal efficiency of a system that has been designed precisely to operate in circumstances where the person who built it is no longer in a position to push the button themselves. William has cut the money, he has issued the eviction notices, he has delivered his 2 sentences and walked away twice. But in doing all of that, he has also backed a cornered adversary into the specific corner where cornered adversaries do the most damage. She may have no money left, but she has the drive. The king was seen walking alone in the private gardens at Highgrove at 10 o'clock on the night of March 12th. Staff who observed him from a distance described a figure moving slowly along the gravel paths with the particular quality of movement that belongs to people who are not walking toward anything but are simply in motion, because standing still is no longer bearable. He was not accompanied. He had declined the presence of his personal secretary and the members of the household staff, whose job it is to ensure that a king is never entirely alone in circumstances that might be difficult. Whatever he was working through in those gardens, he was working through it in the specific privacy that is available to very few people who occupy the position. He occupies the privacy of being alone with a decision that has no good options and that he cannot share with anyone who has not already made up their mind about what the right answer is. The choice that Charles faces is not a political choice or an institutional choice in the ordinary sense of those words. It is the specific and terrible choice that is available only to people at the intersection of family and power. The choice between the obligations of the role and the claims of the people you love, with the added cruelty that, in this case, the obligations and the claims have been made explicitly incompatible by circumstances that cannot be resolved through compromise. If Charles moves to overrule William, to rescind the Coutts mandate and restore the financial arrangements that the audit identified as illegitimate, he will have publicly sided with his wife's family against his son's legally documented case. His approval rating, already fragile at 42%, will not survive the optics. The public has followed this story, and the public understands, in the broad strokes that public understanding takes, that a prince found evidence of financial misconduct and acted on it. A king who reverses that action on behalf of the people who benefited from the misconduct is not a king who will retain the confidence of the population he is constitutionally required to serve. By the evening of March 13th, the situation had been mapped into 3 distinct trajectories, each with its own probability and each with implications extending far beyond the immediate crisis. The first trajectory, carrying approximately 15% of the probability weight, is the disaster scenario. Camilla concludes that she has been stripped of everything worth defending and authorizes the release of the Zurich drive. The black files go public. The royal shadow ledger is decrypted and published. The offshore accounts, the ghost stipend network, the 30 years of diverted payments, all of it becomes part of the public record simultaneously and without any managed disclosure. The resulting constitutional crisis is not survivable through ordinary royal communications management. The monarchy does not pass to William under these circumstances. It faces the kind of institutional reckoning that ends in abolition. The crown ceases to exist not because anyone defeats it, but because the public simply stops believing that it should. The second trajectory, carrying approximately 25% probability, is the disillusionment scenario. William is forced to back down. Not because the legal case fails or because the audit evidence is successfully challenged, but because Charles, on those gravel paths at Highgrove on the night of March 12th, finally makes the choice that a father rather than a king would make, and tells his son directly that if the financial purge continues in its current form, he will abdicate immediately and publicly, forcing a constitutional crisis that would dwarf the financial scandal it was designed to resolve. William, faced with the specific prospect of an uncontrolled royal abdication triggered by his own actions, calculates that a tactical retreat is preferable to an outcome he cannot manage and cannot predict. He rescinds the most extreme elements of the mandate, the eviction notices, the insurance policy freezes, the repossession protocol, while maintaining the core audit findings and the suspension of the direct stipend payments. The financial rot is partially covered again. The legacy alpha findings remain in the public consciousness as a half story that never reaches its conclusion. The monarchy enters a slow institutional decay, not the dramatic constitutional collapse of the disaster scenario, but the more insidious erosion of credibility that comes from a public that senses it was shown the beginning of a truth and then watched it disappear. The kind of decay that does not announce itself with a crisis, but simply accumulates month by month until the institution that was once the subject of global fascination becomes the subject of global indifference. The third trajectory, carrying the remaining 60% of the probability weight and already, by multiple indicators, in motion, is the cleansing scenario. Charles yields, not dramatically, but in the specific way that exhausted men yield to the inevitable when they have run out of alternatives, by stopping the effort to resist. The Parker Bowles financial network is quietly dissolved. The family retains hollow titles for the sake of public decorum, but loses every material benefit that proximity to the crown provided. William becomes the operational sovereign for the remainder of his father's reign. The crown survives fractured. And the drive in Zurich remains in its vault, a sword that was never swung, waiting for a moment that never comes because the conditions that would have triggered it were resolved just enough to prevent it. Step back from the confrontations and the couriers and the Zurich vault and look at the architecture of what William has constructed over the preceding months, and the scale of what has been achieved becomes visible in a way that the individual events do not fully communicate on their own. He has not simply cut a budget or resolved a family dispute or addressed a specific instance of financial misconduct. He has done something considerably more significant. He has fundamentally and permanently altered the terms on which proximity to the crown is available. The Parker Bowles financial network operated for 3 decades because the informal rules governing what family connections entitled people to were never formally codified and therefore never formally enforced. There was always a gap between what the institution officially provided and what it actually provided to the people in its orbit, a gap that had been occupied, then expanded, then exploited with increasing confidence over the years, as each generation of beneficiaries found that the tolerance of the institution had no visible limit. William has closed that gap by being the first person with both the authority and the will to use a legal clause that had been sitting in the Sovereign Grant Act, waiting for exactly this situation, invoked by nobody, because the previous generation of royal leadership had concluded that invoking it would cost more than tolerating what it was designed to address. The moral architecture he has constructed around himself is precise and genuinely difficult to attack. He is the defender of his mother's legacy against the financial exploitation of the institution she devoted her life to and was ultimately consumed by. He is the protector of the taxpayers' money against a shadow court that had been feeding from the public treasury for decades without accountability or transparency. He is the guardian of his children's inheritance against a network systematically diverting the resources that inheritance depends on. Each of these framings is simultaneously a political calculation, the kind of moral positioning that a strategically sophisticated operator constructs before making a move this consequential, and in the evidence of the Legacy Alpha audit and the Andrew Parker Bowles recording, an accurate description of what the investigation actually found. The difficulty of attacking William is that attacking him requires defending the shell companies, the ghost stipends, the offshore accounts, and the 14 million pounds. Nobody who understands the current state of public opinion about the royal family is prepared to make that argument. But the question that the cleansing scenario does not answer, and that the decade ahead will be required to address, is the one about what happens after the cleaning is done and the immediate crisis has passed, and the institution needs to operate as a functioning monarchy rather than as an ongoing purge operation. William has built a power structure of extraordinary concentration and personal coherence, one in which his judgment, his values, and his specific vision for what the institution should be are the operating system that everything else runs on. That kind of concentrated authority produces clarity and decisiveness in a crisis. It is also exactly the kind of authority that becomes a problem when the person at its center is wrong about something important, because the systems that would ordinarily catch and correct that error have been replaced by deference to the central authority. The test of what William has built will not come in the crisis that prompted it. It will come in the first serious challenge of his own reign, when the monarchy needs to be more than one man's conviction that he is right. The countdown has reached 0. The drive is in Zurich. The eviction notices are running their 21 days. Charles is somewhere between his garden and his study, carrying the weight of a choice that should not have been required of him. William is at Adelaide Cottage or in the duchy offices, moving through corridors of power with the confidence of someone who has already arrived. Camilla is in the machinery of Clarence House, stripped of almost every material resource, but in possession of the one thing money cannot replicate: the ability to rewrite the story entirely. The British monarchy has survived 1,000 years of warfare, reformation, revolution, abdication, and the specific modern threat of becoming irrelevant in a world that no longer needs the things it was built to provide. It has survived every one of those threats through a combination of institutional adaptability and the specific, unreplicable quality of symbolic continuity that allows people to believe in it even when they cannot explain precisely why they do. It has never faced the exact combination of threats that confronts it. In March 2026, a financial audit whose findings have been legally weaponized, a 6-minute recording made in a Wiltshire villa that describes a shadow court nobody in the official household will acknowledge, a dead man's switch sitting in a Swiss vault connected to a legal trigger that runs on its own, a shadow sovereign who has not yet been crowned but already controls the institution's finances, a king who cannot choose between his son and his wife, and a queen consort who has been financially dismantled but not yet silenced. The 7 words William spoke in the West Wing corridor were not simply a confrontation between two people. They were a declaration about the kind of institution the monarchy is in the process of becoming. An institution where informal rules are replaced by formal ones, where the gap between what is official and what is actual is being closed painfully and at considerable human cost, by a man who has decided that the cost is worth paying and is prepared to be the one who pays it. Whether that is a monarchy being saved or a monarchy being remade in a single man's image is the question that March 2026 has raised and not yet answered. The drive is in Zurich. The cleansing scenario is in motion. And somewhere in the space between the Swiss vault and the Highgrove Garden, the history of the House of Windsor is being written in real time by people who are not entirely certain how it ends. What do you think is on that drive? What happens when those 21 days expire? And when the full history of this period is finally written, the complete version, not the official one, whose side will it be on? Tell us in the comments. The truth is still arriving.